Well, it's good to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, great to meet you too.
Thanks for doing this.
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Oh, you're well.
Yeah, no, I've
Appreciate
heard a
that.
lot of your stuff, so it's great.
Awesome. Well, yeah, so the community at This Week in Drones is made up of all kinds of stakeholders that I think would like to know how they can be involved, and they like to learn, who the key players are in terms of the World Cup, FIFA World Cup coming 2026 summer, right? And obviously regarding drones, regarding security, and all things that you cover, in your role here. So I was hoping you could just share a little bit, first of all, just your background and kind of what's led up to this role that you have now and what you're doing for FIFA for these games, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I started a long time ago in the special event space. I started as a police officer at 19 years old. And in Minnesota, I couldn't buy my own bullets at 19, so Mom bought the bullets, the department gave me my gun, and I went off on patrol. And one of the very first events I did was the Bullhead Days Festival in Waterville, Minnesota. That was my introduction to special events. That was almost 40 years ago. And from that time, I was a city police officer, a deputy sheriff, a state trooper in Minnesota. I was an FBI agent, retired out of the FBI after 23 years in 2019. And then I went to work for the NFL, and I did almost 4 years with the NFL as the director of international security, and then came over here to FIFA 2 years ago. So my time at the FBI was focused on really all programs that the FBI worked, but I worked counterterrorism missions, I worked criminal missions, I worked WMD or weapons of mass destruction, I worked cybersecurity issues, I worked counterintelligence matters, had a really rich experience. I worked both domestically and internationally, but one of the real seminal responsibilities I had was as the unit chief of the Special Events Management Unit in the Counterterrorism Division. So I managed all of the FBI assets and resources that supported major special events around the world. The Olympics in 2006 in Italy, as well as Super Bowls and Major League Baseball All-Star Games and all that. Awesome. So had a lot of time and experience in special event management and in policing. And at the same time, I've been a nationally registered emergency medical technician for 38 years. So I still work with an ambulance, on a fire department-based ambulance. So I have access and an understanding of fire operations, of EMS operations, and of law enforcement operations, also with private security operations. So all of those things came together to culminate in what I consider to be really the capstone assignment of my career, because everything that I've learned over the course of nearly 40 years has coalesced around this particular project.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, with that said, I was curious what you've seen over your history regarding drones. Mm-hmm. The potential threat of drones to mass gatherings, but also how drones are being used for good, or what? I'm just kind of curious over the years, FBI into NFL into FIFA.
Well, drones really came on the scene, from my perspective anyway, in 2005. I was assigned as the unit chief of the Special Events Management Unit, and we were getting ready for an inauguration in Washington. And I was invited out to the CIA headquarters to talk through some red teaming regarding the potential for drone threats. And it had to do with first the Christmas tree lighting that year in 2005, and then the subsequent inauguration. So I was introduced through a friend of mine who was an Air Force colonel, who was sorting out this issue with the agency about this new and nascent threat of drones. And from that time, I have been paying attention to what this drone landscape looks like and how it has evolved over time. And it went initially from being the threat of what we thought were going to be nation-state actors to this ubiquitous threat of drones that persists from anybody who's a hobbyist or anybody who buys a commercial off-the-shelf product, to, again, some of those nation-state actors that have adapted this technology, both commercial off-the-shelf and stuff they make themselves, into persistent threats. And now we've evolved from single drone threats to swarm threats, just any number of threats, weaponized payloads, CBRNE, or weapons of mass destruction sorts of payloads that can be appended to some of these drones. And the drone landscape is always changing, and so trying to stay ahead of that is really, really challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah, we see that as well. Yeah. So then when it comes to the FIFA World Cup games coming to, is it 11 major cities in North America?
16 cities in North America. So I'll give you a little landscape on that.
Please.
So and why this is such a really, really interesting and epic challenge. For the first time ever, FIFA is coordinating a World Cup across 3 host nations: Canada, Mexico, and the United States. All told, there are 16 cities that are hosting in 3 host nations. We're going to do 48 teams playing 104 matches in 39 days in those 16 cities. But it's not just the 16 host cities. We have about 600 official FIFA sites that will be implicated in our planning for the World Cup. That's training sites, it's hotels, it's airports, it's transportation hubs, it's, of course, the stadiums, FIFA fan festival locations, a lot of areas that need to have some sort of an assessment and a protection package.
Wow. Okay. So in light of that, you said over 600 locations, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say are the biggest gaps that you can share to industry and to SLTT, law enforcement agencies, gathering events that are listening in? Can you share any sort of like gap that you're focused on that you'd like to see us focus on over the next 6 months altogether in terms of counter UAS, in terms of drones? Like, do we, is there somewhere we can kind of focus in and hone in from your perspective?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I think immediately come to mind. When we talk about gaps, we're often talking about counter UAS capabilities or gaps in the ability to take a drone out of the sky that might present a threat to us. So that is one issue. That gap is narrowing very quickly, in fact, and I'll come back to that. The other gap that we have right now and an area of focus for us is how to thoughtfully integrate drone technology for good in these same spaces that we're trying to defend against. So when I got to the NFL, drones were bad, full stop. Nobody wanted to see drones in or around any stadium ecosystem at all because they were perceived as a threat. I'm a former FBI pilot, and I was a drone pilot. I'm a Part 107 pilot, and I worked in a counter-drone startup for a time in my gap year between my time at the FBI and my time with the NFL. So I had been exposed to a lot of the counter-drone technologies. And while they covered down on some of the threat, they didn't necessarily adapt very well to drones for good. So what we thoughtfully did, I think, at the NFL was we created a pathway to bring drones for good into the game day ecosystem. And we think about drones for entertainment, for broadcast, for public safety purposes. The critical piece in integrating drones into a game day experience where you're also protecting against drones is you have to be able to understand the airspace domain and deconflict and coordinate what happens in that domain. Mm-hmm. We don't have an unmanned traffic management program in the United States. You can't call the tower and say, I'm getting ready to fly my drone. So nobody is deconflicting what's happening at 400 feet AGL and below. And increasingly with the rogues that are going above 400 feet, right? So that's a gap for us right now. So what we have to do is we have to look to thought leaders in the space to identify airspace domain management, particularly over these major special events, and deconflict the drones for good while we're still prohibiting drones that are bad from those restricted airspaces around these major special events. Mm-hmm. So two real big gaps. One is this unmanned traffic management piece, and the other is the counter UAS capabilities gap. And for about the last 5 years or so, I've been an active voice in this space as well, trying to get mitigation tools and technology into the hands of state, local, tribal, and territorial cops. As you well know, there's at least 4 federal statutes that are implicated if somebody uses mitigation technology, particularly using radio frequency-based mitigation technology. If we don't suspend those laws for duly qualified, authorized, and supervised officers, then we're telling the cops they can't protect these spaces, or if they do protect the spaces, we're making criminals out of the cops. That's a problem, right? So what we need to do is change the legislative authorities, give the authorities to those state, local, tribal, and territorial cops to augment the federal officials who already have this mitigation authority to ensure that we can cover more spaces over a more persistent time. And we talk about the incredible resource drain that will be on the World Cup with resources at 104 matches in 39 days, 78 of which are in the United States. We've got some work to do.
Wow. Okay. So actually, I wanted to ask about how you see those coordinations and maybe explain to folks the the FIFA's role, and then the federal agencies, and then like state, local, communities, because everybody's going to probably bring different technologies to bear. Maybe some of them get trained to do counter UAS down the line, maybe some SLTTs, but I'm just kind of curious because there's a lot of pieces, a lot of players, you talk to anyone today and they're like, I'm not sure my role yet. I don't know who to report to, but can you clarify some of that as you'd see it working best, over the next 6 months? Yeah,
I would love to see this as a government-led effort to secure the airspace over major special events. The reality is this patchwork of federal laws and state laws and local laws and provincial laws in Canada it really makes that very, very complicated. And we don't have a single federal government that can lead the security apparatus over the World Cup with operations in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, we've got at least 3 nations that are all trying to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. I see each of them as being the thought leaders in their space and responsible for their airspace management. Inherently, federal airspace is federal, right? So federal authorities should be defending that airspace. The reality is, though, because this is nascent technology, it's space that isn't very well populated by people that have really deep and rich experience in special event management, we have taken a step forward as FIFA to try to coordinate some of the bodies that have a role in airspace security, and particularly related to that first issue I pointed out of the airspace domain management. So we have a system in place whereby somebody who wants to fly a drone for positive purposes over the World Cup will come to us for an endorsement. We want to know where they want to fly, when they want to fly, how high they want to fly. We don't have an authority that allows us to collect all that information, but we're doing it with this coalition of the willing. So if you're a commercial drone pilot and you're flying for broadcast purposes or marketing or commercial purposes and want to fly in one of the restricted airspaces around one of our sites, we'd like you to come to us and tell us that that's what your intent is. So we can then coordinate with all of the stakeholders that we've taken the time to identify: local police, municipal police, provincial police, state police, federal police, and others who are in the commercial drone space who also want to fly at competing times. If we understand what everybody wants to do, we can put a foot forward in deconflicting what everybody wants to do. At the same time, we're taking these proactive drone operations and considering how they're going to apply to our ecosystem. We can whitelist those good guy drones in those counter UAS systems and clearly communicate expectations to the folks that are charged with protecting the airspace to say, this is what you can expect at this time, at this location, and with this particular equipment that's been whitelisted in your system. We have some hard and fast rules. We don't want people to fly over people, and we don't want them to fly over the stadium bowl. We are not using drones for live broadcast. We'll use drones for color shots because we don't want the broadcaster to be dependent on that drone shot and then exert some pressure on a pilot to get that epic shot when, in fact, that might complicate the security profile or the safety profile of that particular drone flight. So we seek to get this domain awareness piece sorted out by providing some thought leadership in this space. And I've hired 2 people to do that. One is a 39-year retired FAA air traffic controller who has worked in airspace security for the last 20 years of his career. And the other is a former Apache helicopter pilot from the Army who is very, very proficient in drones and what the drone legislation and policies are. Not only is she a former Army officer and pilot, but she's an attorney. So she understands this as well. And those 2 people are the ones that are driving our airspace security working group. We had a meeting this week with that working group, and it was nearly 180 people. So there's clearly a hunger here. There is an awareness that needs to go out to everybody who's going to touch this ecosystem at any time, and we're going to provide what leadership we can. We're very clear to say we don't approve flights. We don't own the airspace. FIFA is a private entity, but in the absence of a government entity that's coordinating this response, we're stepping into that space, leveling up all of our government partners with us to ensure that everybody has an understanding of what the threats are, what the potential solutions are, and who's using the airspace and how.
So then how can people engage depending on who they are, if they're a vendor or they're a consultant, or if they are maybe an SLTT, a law enforcement agency? I'm sure it's kind of different depending on who they are, but how can we engage with you, and FIFA in that, and over the next 6 months and beyond?
The only flights that will be approved into the airspace over FIFA events, and this is up to the FAA, they'll decide who's approved to fly over those areas. But the only ones that we will endorse to fly are the ones that come through our portal. And those are going to be people that are stakeholders in the World Cup. So if it's a broadcast partner or a commercial partner or a marketing partner, something that we have a contractual relationship with. If it's state, local, tribal, and territorial, we invite them into that ecosystem too, so that they are identifying for us where they want to fly and when they want to fly. And we've stratified our endorsements at priority levels so that we know that police will have the first priority. If there are conflicts in the airspace, everybody else lands, the police will manage whatever the public safety emergency is. They have the right of first refusal on the airspace. And then if the broadcasters are covering something and there's no public safety emergency ongoing, the broadcasters will fly. And we'll stratify who is going to fly where. We aren't going to allow anybody who's a hobbyist to fly, or at least our request of the government is not to allow anybody who's a hobbyist to fly into these airspaces. And the only thing that we're really trying to get our arms around are those restricted airspaces. So there's got to be a TFR, or there's got to be some other authority to act for law enforcement or security that we will anchor on before we'll start to worry about who's in the airspace. Otherwise, we've got people that are flying tangentially around our events all the time. We just don't have the aptitude or the bandwidth really to be able to manage all of those things. We're focusing particularly on those official FIFA sites, stadiums, fan festivals, training sites, hotels, that sort of thing.
And that's still the number, the 600 number?
That's right.
Okay,
that's right.
So
we want to know who's flying in those areas.
Okay.
But outside of those areas, regulations and the rules of the FAA or the Transport Canada, NAV Canada, and Mexican authorities are what are going to govern it. But Part 107 pilots in the United States only. Hobbyists can't fly in the restricted airspace. And usually or normally somebody who's got a contractual relationship with FIFA.
For sure.
So that we have an awareness. So this includes teams and officials if the officials need it for their officials training camp. And again, those commercial and broadcast partners.
Perfect. So then technology, I'm really curious. You've described this UTM, unmanned traffic management system, this almost like single pane of glass where you see who's out there. That's a media drone, that's a police drone, that's maybe a nefarious drone. We don't know who it is. We saw a list of technologies come out recently with the DHS, FEMA, NOFO, right, the grant funding, and it specified really core layers of detection and that we've seen in the industry for a long time: radars, cameras, RF, remote ID, and some mitigation tools. But it seems to me, like as I've seen in the industry, that those two worlds are kind of coming together: the counter drone and the hey, let's enable drones to fly, because it's typically the same set of sensors once they're in place that can be utilized to say, here's everything that's out here. Here's the ones that are tagged as being white labeled. Here's the ones that aren't, right? I mean, I'm curious from your perspective if you have any comments on technology or thoughts on, if you think maybe those sorts of technologies that the NOFO had listed out will be kind of probably the standard, or just anything on that, because we do have a lot of viewers that are technology companies, a wide array. And everyone's been working hard, even with Part 108, with like, hey, how can we enable drone delivery of all kinds of cool things, blood infusions and all these things. Right. And I think everyone's trying to see how that technology can work together, in the next 6 months. We've got 6 months to, start to deploy something that's scalable for both of those. But I don't know, any comments that you may have that.
So the technology space is absolutely fascinating right now, and this is moving so quickly. And again, I've been advocating for this state, local, tribal, territorial authorities piece for at least 5 years, and now we're seeing a lot of that move forward. And I do have to give shout out to the current administration and to the White House Task Force for putting their shoulder behind this to get action from not only the National Security Council, which that action was starting before the task force was stood up, but the National Security Council has made some really thoughtful moves on executive orders in this space, and Congress is now considering under the National Defense Authorization Act some changes that will be lasting and persistent changes for good, I think, in this space. The technology that will support those, the leveraging of those authorities is really exciting. The concern that I have with the way it's being approached is just the lack of consistency in the type of technology that's going to be used. And the reason I have a concern about that is what I'd like to see happen is for us to have a really consistent approach to drone mitigation across the entire country, and in our case, across North America for the purpose of this tournament. If we have different technologies used by different state, local, tribal, and territorial officers in different areas, they have to be applied differently. There may be different rules that are going to apply to them. The applicability of the equipment on a particular problem set is going to be a little bit different. The model that I've advocated for, and many of my colleagues have advocated for, is a single schoolhouse, which we have for training on technologies, but then a consistent set of tools. And what that does is it builds individual capacity or individual capability, rather, in individual host cities. So everybody has a drone protection over the city for which they're responsible. But it also, at the same time, if we're consistent in the application of technology, builds a collective capacity across the country or the entire continent here. So that leaves us better off after the World Cup if now Houston is no longer a city that is going to be working in the LA Olympics, right? But LA may need some help. If we have consistent technology and consistent protocols, we can lift and shift that group from Houston to go and support LA at the next big major special event. So the more consistency, the more interoperability we have across the country, the better our collective capacity is. And that can be leveraged for major special events, for counterterrorism cases, for major criminal incidents, for natural disasters. If everybody's singing from the same sheet of music, we're going to be in a much better position to be able to manage the problem. If everybody's got this patchwork of solutions, it becomes much more difficult to integrate. That's
Absolutely.
a challenge.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, like you said, interoperability. Yeah. If each tool has interoperability built in mind, then it's easier to kind of everyone talk into the same ecosystem. Right.
The challenge with that, though, and pardon me, is that no tool has all the answers, right? So the best solution is a layered solution that includes electro-optical and acoustic and radar-based and RF detection and maybe even a GPS detection tool. You know, some of these things have to be integrated in a really thoughtful way. And to be most effective, they have to have these layered solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, any kind of final words? I mean, we hit a lot of the bits and pieces I think that are important, and obviously you guys are doing a great job and aligning the communication, setting up these standards, these protocols. You know, that's a big takeaway for me, is just how can we feed into the simplicity and that kind of single voice, you know, in terms of training, in terms of interoperability. But just, I guess, any final thoughts for the industry? We've got, what is it, 6 months maybe, you know, to be like on game, like game time, right? So we've got only a few months to actually deploy technologies, trainings, workshops, you know, all sorts of things. So just, I think people are still kind of, you know, scrambling a bit at the moment. So
I appreciate you asking this question. There are a couple of good strategies I think that would be really useful, and if you could amplify our voice, I would appreciate it. One of them is, if you don't have an obligation that is a contractual obligation or a public safety obligation in or around these official FIFA sites, leave your drone at home. There's no room for you in the ecosystem here. There's no space for you to fly, because what you're going to do is you're going to complicate those public safety responders. You're going to complicate what we're trying to do to share what is the World Cup with the world through our broadcast feeds. If you're not a commercial pilot who has a reason to be in that airspace and is appropriately vetted and validated with your certificate of waiver or authorization, you have no business being in the airspace. And this will be protected vigorously by public safety partners, state, local, tribal, and territorial, even if we do a two-legged mitigation, where we detect something and send a team out to go and talk to the pilot, right? Or if we do the actual mitigation using a kinetic or a non-kinetic means. There will be enforcement around these official FIFA sites. So leave your drone at home. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you are in the public safety space, or if you're in the technology vendor space, or you have some other sort of connection to airspace and airspace awareness, be careful about where you're getting your information. The information is moving very, very quickly, but we have at FIFA an airspace security team that can provide the right answers and the correct assumptions about what this tournament's about, where it's going to be operating, who's going to be at what team base camps, all of that stuff. Come to us and we'll help either fold you in or provide the answers that are going to be the correct answers. If you're state, local, tribal, or territorial police, please work with us to help us understand where you want to fly and when you want to fly. You're going to be given priority to fly in there, but what is troubling for me sometimes, and I've experienced this both at the NFL and at FIFA, is this hubris or this arrogance that sometimes comes from law enforcement. And I say that with the best of intentions. 35 years, I carried a badge and a gun. So I'm one of these cops. But cops will come sometimes say, hey, we're the cops. We don't have to get an approval or an endorsement or anything from anybody. We're going to fly where we want to fly. That is so short-sighted in today's environment, because there are so many people using the airspace. And unless you, as the police, are going to actively deconflict your airspace management, don't take that perspective. You know, go to the folks that are trying to actively deconflict that airspace management. Tell us what you want to do. You're going to be given priority. We want to fold you into that. We want you to be a part of the system of systems that solves this problem, and not somebody who just thinks that they have a protection mission that trumps everything. They don't need to coordinate. So coordination and communication is the watchword as we're trying to put this together. What I'm really cognizant about is not making bad policy. So we want to do things for the right reasons. We don't want to set back what the industry has been able to accomplish in the last 5 or 10 years by making really bad decisions, or God forbid, having a collision of 2 unmanned aircraft over a stadium at the World Cup because somebody thought they had the right to be operating in a place that perhaps they didn't. So coordination, communication. We want to be good partners in this space. We know we don't control the airspace. We're a private entity, as I said before, but we're a stakeholder here, and we're just trying to play the role of the honest broker to bring people together, to coordinate people, to make sure that everybody remains safe and secure, and we've got this service-oriented focus in delivery of the World Cup.
Awesome. Well, thank you, GB Jones. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, David.